Um, so thank you everyone for joining us for this Caribbean bird banding webinar. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. There will be periods to ask questions in English or Spanish, whichever language you're most comfortable in. But while Holly is giving her presentation, we would just ask that everybody please keep your microphones muted, just so that there's no interference while she's speaking. And then, yes, like I said, we will have some periods for questions. And so hold on to them, write them down, and then you can either put them in the chat when we have the question period, or of course you can unmute yourself and ask in person. So let's go ahead and get started. So, for anyone who is not familiar with Birds Caribbean, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of Caribbean birds and their habitats in the insular Caribbean. And this webinar is part of a series that we're going to hold within our Caribbean bird banding program, which aims to build capacity for bird banding operations in the Caribbean and also foster a community of bird banders and those interested in learning about bird banding. So as I said, this webinar is one of a series that we're going to hold around Caribbean bird banding with presentations, of course, about Molt, which we're very excited to hear about today. And also, we're going to have webinars about banding station management, analysis of bird banding data, and other exciting bird banding topics. So just putting that out there now to please stay tuned for more information about future webinars. And today, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Holly Garrod, who many of you know very closely. She is the Caribbean Bird Banding Network Coordinator, and she has extensive experience banding birds all over the world at this point, but of course, lots of experience in the Caribbean. And she's going to talk about all kinds of exciting molt topics today. And I know this is a topic that a lot of you are really interested in learning more about. So without further ado, Holly, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Maya. Really excited. Let me just go ahead and queue up this presentation. Okay, I sent a request to share. Okay, cool. Cool. Let me just check. All right, is there everyone able to, you can see? Looks good?
Yes,
Awesome.
you are good.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk about molt, especially. So for some of you, this presentation, if you've been at one of our bird banding workshops, this presentation will likely look familiar. However, I'm really excited because I've spent the whole last week modifying it a lot. So it's now completely bilingual. And additionally, I've changed almost all of the photos to be Caribbean focused birds. So hopefully some of these examples will look familiar to some people. Yeah, and I'm excited to talk about molt because I think it's something that no matter how many times you learn about it, it's always good to review. So let's kick this off. Molt in Caribbean passerines. So first, I think it's just always good to review basic molt terminology. Let me just see if I can get a little laser pointer here. Great. And so I think especially we're going to be referring a lot of times to the wing, and often when we're talking about molt or molt limits, which is something we'll define a little later, we usually are looking within the wing. So within our wing, we have our primaries here, which is our outer, usually 9 to 10 feathers in passerines. We have our secondaries, which are the next 6 feathers. We have our tertials here. We have our greater coverts above the secondaries, also known as secondary coverts. Above those, we have our median coverts, and above those, we have our lesser coverts. Then, of course, we have our primary coverts, which cover the primaries. And right in between the greater coverts and primary coverts, we have this little guy here who's the carpal covert. We also have these 3 alula feathers, and then we have our retrices. So usually when we're aging a bird, these are the main feather tracks that we're using. Often when I try to teach workshops, I'll usually make this more interactive, but via Zoom, that's a little tough. But just know that if we were live, I would probably try to quiz you all on these. So these are just really good to know. You don't have to memorize them, but oftentimes the more you're looking at birds and the more you're looking at wings, you kind of inadvertently end up memorizing all of the names of these feathers. So, but then it's also good to just quickly review what's our basic feather anatomy. So we have our rachis, which is our central shaft of the feathers, and then kind of going out of those are barbs, and then off of the barbs, you can see as we kind of zoom in are barbules, and each barbule has these little hooklets, and so that's what kind of allows birds to zip their feathers together when they're preening. Um, so we can see that that kind of allows them to kind of keep their feathers clean. But often, one of the things we look at, and this is something I'll talk about later in the presentation, is we can look at the density of these barbs. So we often see juvenile feathers are grown quicker and grown in lower quality, which is something, again, I'll get into later in this presentation. So we often see lower barb density in juvenile feathers and higher barb density, as in more of these barbs kind of tighter together in adult quality feathers. So that's often when often we're referring to barb density, this is kind of what we're referring to. And we can also often look at rachis color as well when we are aging birds. Also, just real quick, when we're talking about feathers, usually we talk about them in tracks. So tracks would be these groups of feathers. So you can kind of see that birds kind of grow these feathers in groups on their bodies. And so they often don't, they do have feathers all over their bodies, but when they grow them, they kind of grow. And when they're, I guess when they're growing them in a planned molt to say, they will grow them in these groups of feathers together. Often we see that symmetrically. And that's, again, one of the things we look at when we're aging birds. So just a quick review of feather tracks. And then, of course, we have different types of feathers. We have, of course, tail feathers and wing feathers, which tend to be higher quality feathers, also known, as flight feathers oftentimes. They tend to be higher quality. They tend to look nicer. We have semi-plume feathers, which are more of the downy feathers that act as insulation. And of course, down feathers. We have contour feathers, which are those body feathers. And then, of course, we can have phyloplumes and just other specialized feathers depending on the bird. We can have rectal bristles, which we see, rictal bristles, sorry, which we see in along the beak. So there's all sorts of different feather types we see. And we can often, when we're comparing adult and juvenile feathers, we usually want to compare the same type of feathers. And then just to review real quick, we usually want to review our flight feathers. So often in this presentation, I'm going to be separating feathers by flight feathers and by body feathers. So when I'm talking about flight feathers, I'm referring to feathers that are usually defined as directly connecting to the bone. So you can see the primaries all connect to the carpometacarpus, and the secondaries and tertials all connect to the ulna. We do also consider the primary coverts as flight feathers as well, and that's because those are often grown with each of the primaries that they cover. So versus the greater coverts will kind of molt in a group, the lesser and median coverts will molt in a group, but primary coverts will molt with their corresponding primary. So, and then we also have our rectrices, which are our flight feathers, and those are directly into the, I believe, tailbone. So again, just to review, our flight feathers include primaries, secondaries, rectrices as true flight feathers. Tertials are considered true flight feathers, so they're often lumped in with body feathers based on the way they molt. That's, again, something I'll cover a little later in this. But we have primary, secondaries, rectrices, and primary coverts. And so if we look at the general life cycle of a bird, there's usually three things that occur every year. Usually we have a breeding attempt or a breeding event. We usually have a molt, so a complete replacement of feathers. And then we usually have some sort of dispersal or migration or movement. And so this can really vary across time and vary across species, vary across location, but we're usually going to see what the birds try to do these three things every year. But what's really interesting, and one of the reasons that people like me really nerd out on molt so much, so within a year, often birds may or may not be able to breed. So if there's not enough resources, or if they have an early nest failure, they might forego breeding that year. If weather or resources, again, kind of change, the birds' movement patterns might shift, or they might not move as much as they otherwise would. However, we will see every single year birds will do this molt. So they will do a complete replacement of feathers. That's kind of a non-negotiable for birds. And again, it's something, it's why it's really important that we kind of look at molt when we're aging birds, because it's something that will occur every year. We also do have with birds in their first year, they're going to have this kind of distinct juvenile plumage, and that is not going to repeat every year. So we do have in the first year of the bird some things that are a little bit different, but then after that, kind of every year should be the same. So we're gonna jump straight into molt. So why do birds actually molt? So birds molt because feathers wear out over time, and when they're wearing out, they lose their integrity and their associated function. And so that means that birds cannot fly as well, might not be as colorful, might not look as good for trying to attract a mate. So every single year, birds are going to do this complete replacement of feathers so that they can assure that their feathers have this full functionality. But what we see is the timing, frequency, duration, and extent of molt probably evolved in response to behavioral and environmental pressures. So we do see variation in this. And this is when we start getting really interested in what kind of molts are these birds doing and what can that tell us about what the birds are doing within their life cycle right now. So we can see variation in how many feathers the birds are molting. We can see variation in how frequently the birds are molting. And especially in the tropics, we start to see a lot more plasticity with molt, which is pretty cool and something we're still trying to understand. So now that we know kind of why birds molt, it's really important to what do we consider an actual molt? So what we consider a molt is the regular and orderly growth of feathers by which a plumage is acquired. So that's to say this is a planned growth of feathers. What we can also have is we can have accidental or adventitious molt. So this is not what we consider a true molt because these feathers were accidentally replaced. And so if we look, we can kind of see this little chunk of feathers looks nicer. We can see this chunk of feathers looks nicer. And this bird didn't replace these feathers as part of a planned molt. It replaced them accidentally. Most likely, it could have been from a fight, from trying to escape a predator. And so that's one of the really cool things with birds is similar to reptiles, because birds are reptiles, they are able to replace feathers when they lose them, especially tail feathers. So oftentimes birds have this cool adaptation similar to lizards where birds can lose their entirety of their tail feathers to escape a predator, and then they can grow all of their tail feathers back. This is what's known as fright molt. We see it a lot of times in pigeons, which lose a ton of feathers if you've ever caught a pigeon. But these aren't things that we consider true molt because the bird didn't plan to replace these feathers. It replaced them out of necessity, out of losing the feathers and needing to replace them, not out of trying to grow a new plumage. So those are just some things. And especially when we're going to get into the WRP codes and when we use if a bird is molting or not, we want to really be thinking about, is that bird actively molting into a new plumage or is it just replacing some accidental feathers? So this I'll cover really quick. So for the most part, I will say I was able to get almost all of the slides in this bilingual, but there are some instances I kept things in English just because we tend to use the more English terminology, which is again a Northern Hemisphere or a global North bias, I would say. But with this, what we see is we have had kind of a change in terminology. This is most important if you're using the old pile guide and the black pile guide for passerines and near passerines. You will need to kind of do this translation in your head. So formerly, we kind of had birds. The traditional system was the juvenile plumage, followed by first winter plumage, followed by first breeding plumage. But then in 1959, the Humphrey Park system came out, and after the juvenile plumage, they termed that as the first basic plumage. And then, of course, then your alternate plumage is kind of replacing the term breeding. And then basic plumage is replacing the term winter plumage, just as kind of being the default plumage, so to speak. However, with the first basic molt and first pre-basic molt, first basic plumage, it's typically a partial or incomplete molt in a lot of passerines. And so because of this, as every other pre-basic molt is defined as a complete replacement of feathers, we actually now have a new terminology for this, which is the pre-formative molt and molting into a formative plumage. So formative you can think of as subadult. So it's a plumage that's almost adult. It's like a teenager plumage. In most birds, the formative plumage looks almost identical to the adult plumage, and in many cases it does. But because it's a partial or incomplete molt, which again is something we're going to talk about in just a little bit, what we often see is we can see contrast with juvenile feathers. So the important thing here is just to know anytime that we see first pre-basic molt in older manuscripts, in the older pile guide, we want to translate that into pre-formative molt and formative plumage. That's the basic takeaway from this. And so let's jump in to our molt strategies now. So what's really cool is all birds in the world can be broken down into having one of these four molt strategies. And so I'm going to review them and then we're going to jump into more molt stuff. So for the molt strategies, there's a cool graphic that actually one of our trainers, Zoya, helped me come up with. And I think it's really cool to kind of think about this is how you can kind of break it down into finding your molt strategy. And there's just two questions you have to ask. So first, does this bird have an alternate molt or a breeding plumage? And if the answer is yes, then we're going to jump into our alternate strategy. And if the answer is no, then we're going to jump into our basic strategy. And so our second question is there an inserted molt only in the first year of the bird's life? So that's one additional molt that we only see in the first year. Every year after, the bird will not do that molt. And so if the answer is yes, then we are in complex. And so we can put those together, right? So we have an alternate plumage and an inserted molt. We're in our complex alternate strategy. If we have an alternate molt but not an inserted molt, we're in our simple alternate strategy. And so likewise, if we don't have an alternate plumage, we're in our basic strategy. And if we have that inserted molt, we're in our complex basic strategy, which I would say the majority of birds fall into this category. And if we do not have an inserted molt, then we're in our simple basic strategy. So we're going to review these from the bottom going up, from the simplest to the most complex, as you can see in the nomenclature. So first, let's review our simple basic strategy. So this is often something that we see in raptors. So a lot of times with raptors, they're able to spend more time in the nest so they can grow higher quality juvenile feathers. So their juvenile feathers can actually last them for a full year until they have to do that full replacement. And that's why oftentimes when we're out birding, we can often ID juvenile raptors for the first year of their life. And so first, we're going to start out in the nest. So we have our first cycle, and so from the nest, we have our first pre-basic molt or our pre-juvenile molt. So if you remember kind of that terminology I mentioned, our pre-juvenile molt, we do also consider our first pre-basic molt, and that's because it is the first complete molt in a bird's life. So it's the first time the bird's growing all of those feathers at once. A lot of our birds are kind of starting from naked, from nothing, and growing all our feathers. So we consider the pre-juvenile molt, the first pre-basic molt, the juvenile plumage, the first basic plumage now. Again, we just term that juvenile because it is often a more distinct plumage, usually to help birds kind of camouflage in their first year as they're sort of learning the ropes of being a bird. So within the nest, we have our first pre-basic molt or pre-juvenile molt. And when the birds leave the nest, we have our first basic or juvenile plumage. So the bird is going to spend an entire year like that. 1 year later, it's going to do its second pre-basic molt into its second basic plumage. And then 1 year later, it'll do its third pre-basic molt into its third basic plumage. Sorry, that should be an error. It should say third. And then every year after, so the bird will only have one molt per year, and that will be a complete replacement of feathers. So that's our simple basic strategy, often seen in raptors. And again, we use juvenile due to familiarity, but in this case, when you see first basic plumage, that is synonymous with juvenile plumage. Though I try to use juvenile because, again, it's a bit more distinct. But that's why we can go from our juvenile to our second pre-basic molt or second basic plumage, because the first basic plumage is the juvenile. So now let's jump to our next strategy. So what happens, we still stay in our basic strategy, but now let's add an inserted molt only into the first year of this bird's life. So that's what we call our complex basic strategy. And so with this, we can think of this as a lot of our passerine birds, especially ones that don't have any sort of alternate molt, right? So this can be a lot of our birds in the Caribbean, such as our spindalis, palm tanagers, Antillean bullfinches. Actually not banana quits, I think are alternate. So, but a lot of our basic passerines. And what we see here is we are in the nest, right? And we have our first pre-basic molt or first pre-juvenile molt into our juvenile or first basic plumage. And now, usually with passerines, right? Passerines, when they're in the nest, it's a really dangerous place for them because if you've ever seen nestlings, they're fairly helpless and they make a really good snack for a lot of predators. So because of that, we see that these nestlings want to get out of the nest as quickly as possible. And so they're going to grow that juvenile plumage very quickly, which means it's a low quality plumage. So often too, we might see this juvenile plumage look more distinct. If you've ever seen a baby robin or a baby red-legged thrush or a baby clay-colored thrush, you'll often see them covered in these little buffy colored triangles. That's the distinct juvenile plumage, and this helps them kind of blend in a little bit more, especially baby birds. You might find them on the ground, and there's a lot of PSAs, public service announcements, to leave baby birds on the ground because they're still learning how to fly, learning how to be a bird. And so this juvenile plumage is distinct, and it's often low quality. Often we see the feathers look looser and fluffier. And so because of that, those feathers are not going to last this bird a year. So what we have is the, oh no, we have the formative plumage and we have the pre-formative molt. So the bird is going to go from a juvenile plumage, usually shortly after leaving the nest, or maybe like a week or so after leaving the nest. It's going to do a pre-formative molt and molt into a formative plumage. But because this bird is younger, because it doesn't quite have all the energy it needs, these birds can't afford to replace all of their feathers again because they just spent all this time in the nest growing these feathers. So often we see this as a partial or incomplete molt. And so that's why you can see some of these yellow juvenile feathers are retained, and the bird is going to wear this formative, so adult-like plumage for an entire year. It's going to most likely try to reproduce, and after its first reproductive attempt, it's going to do its second pre-basic molt and then molt into its second basic plumage. And so this is where it's going to be a complete molt, so it's going to replace all of its feathers, and then thereafter we'll only have one molt per year, which is that pre-basic molt. And so we only see in that first year the formative plumage, so you can always think formative first year. And that is, again, because the juvenile feathers are low quality, so the bird wants to replace as many of those as it can, but often can't afford to replace all of them. So now what happens if we have a bird with a breeding plumage or an alternate plumage? So let's start with our simple alternate strategy. So this is a bird that does not have that inserted molt in the first year, but does have an alternate or breeding plumage. And so with these birds, often we can think of them as, a lot of times we see them as seabirds, gulls, maybe waterfowl. I think actually some waterfowl do have a preformative molt though, but usually a lot of times it tends to be water birds, seabirds. And so we start out in the nest and we have our first pre-basic molt or pre-juvenile molt to our juvenile plumage. And then halfway through the year, before this bird is going to breed, it is going to do a pre-alternate molt, molting into an alternate plumage, and then it is going to, then after it tries its first breeding attempt, or maybe it won't, and maybe it'll just assist at a nest, but it will spend half the year in its first alternate plumage, which we will see as a mix between juvenile and alternate feathers, and then it will do its second basic molt or second pre-basic molt into its second basic plumage. And so from here again, this is going to be a complete or mostly complete molt, and the bird is going to be half the year in its second basic plumage and then molt into an alternate plumage. And then we're going to alternate every year from basic into alternate plumage. Usually the alternate molt is going to be a limited to partial molt. So again, the bird isn't going to replace all its feathers. So you're going to see this mix between basic and alternate feathers. And then the first year, you'll see a mix between juvenile and alternate feathers. And for some birds, like if you think about gulls, that might take 3 or 4 molt cycles, as we say, or 3 or 4 years to get into that full adult plumage. They'll likely still do a complete or mostly complete pre-basic molt. It'll just be a distinct second basic plumage and then a distinct third basic plumage until they get into that adult, what we call definitive basic plumage. So that is our simple alternate strategy, alternating between a basic and alternate molt. So now to go into our most complex strategy, which is our complex alternate strategy. So this is where we are going to have an inserted molt in the first cycle, and we are going to alternate between basic and alternate plumage. So this oftentimes you can think about as migratory songbirds. So oftentimes our warblers, our tanagers that migrate, these tend to be the birds that we really see in the fall. They migrate in one plumage, and in the spring they migrate in a different plumage. So if we want to review that, what we have is We start in the nest, right? We have our first pre-basic molt, our first pre-juvenile molt into our juvenile plumage. Again, with these birds, that juvenile plumage is going to be very low quality. And so they want to do this first pre-formative molt into a formative plumage, the formative plumage being a partial to incomplete molt. So we're going to see mostly formative plumage, but some retain juvenile feathers. But this bird also wants to try to breed and wants to try to look better for breeding season. So then before it migrates back north, usually on its overwintering grounds, so something we might see in the Caribbean or we might see in Central America, they're going to do their first pre-alternate molt, and we're going to get into the alternate plumage. And so here what we're actually going to see, it's not illustrated well in this picture, is we're going to see the bird have 3 generations of feathers. The bird is going to have juvenile, formative, and alternate feathers. So we see 3 generations of feathers. After the bird does its breeding attempt, it's going to do a complete pre-basic molt, the second pre-basic molt, and then every year it is just going to continue alternating between a second basic and second alternate plumage, third basic, third alternate plumage, and so every year it will do a complete molt. That'll be that complete replacement of feathers or the pre-basic molt, and then right before it migrates north again, it'll do a pre-alternate molt, getting into that alternate plumage. So I know this is the most complex, but hopefully it's not too scary. So what we also are going to do is we're going to define molts in cycles. So all species have a pre-basic molt, and that's what we use to define the start of each cycle. So that's why our pre-juvenile molt is considered the first pre-basic molt, because that is starting the bird's life, that is starting the bird's cycle. And so every year, approximately for most birds, 1 year afterwards, they do a pre-basic molt. They will do another pre-basic molt a year later. So how we age birds within a plumage-based aging system is we define each year of a bird's life by when it starts that next pre-basic molt. So we have our first cycle, we have our second cycle would be when the second pre-basic molt starts, our third cycle when the third pre-basic molt starts, and then we have the time between 2 pre-basic molts then is defined as 1 cycle, and we have additional molts inserted due to different adaptations. And then again, the pre-basic molt we almost always define as a complete molt, though we do see in some, as always, there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. And so in this case, we do see in some seabirds and in larger birds like raptors, we can't have an incomplete pre-basic molt just because a lot of these birds spend a lot of time in the air, a lot of time flying, and they really can't afford to do that complete replacement. So they'll replace as many feathers as they can, usually a good chunk, and then wait until next year to replace more. But they usually grow these feathers very slowly. So again, they're just very high quality feathers that might not wear down as much as the passerine that's kind of maybe beating its feathers up more in like bushes or in the understory. But what we see oftentimes is we really can't, once a bird does a complete replacement of its feathers, we can no longer tell the difference between a third basic and a fifth basic and a 10th basic. And so what we do is we call it the definitive cycle. And so that's kind of what we define as the adult cycle, because that bird will continue definitively in that plumage. And so once we have our second pre-basic molt, we can distinguish the second pre-basic molt because we will have juvenile and basic feathers. But once we lose any presence of juvenile feathers, we just enter into the definitive cycle basic. And so our second basic plumage, we would now term as our definitive basic plumage. And so now let's talk a little bit, I was mentioning a little bit about partial and incomplete molts. So let's actually get into what those mean. And so those do actually have specific definitions. And so I'm going to call you back to when we were discussing the difference between flight feathers and body feathers, right? So just another quick review. Our flight feathers include our primaries, our primary coverts, our secondaries. Tertials are technically considered flight feathers, but often molt with the body feathers, and our rectrices. And then, of course, our body feathers is going to be everything else. So all of our feathers on the head, on the chest, on the back, body feathers. All of our other wing coverts, this is something that can confuse people, those are considered body feathers. So greater coverts, body feathers. Alula, body feathers. Lesser covert, body feathers. Median coverts, body feathers. Carpal covert, body feathers. So all of those are considered body feathers because they can molt on their own. They usually don't molt with the other feathers of the wing. As well, our tail coverts are also considered body feathers. So this is just an important distinction to make as we define the different extents of these molts. So our molt extent, first we start with absent. So and I'm going to go over these each a little bit more in detail as well. So this is a quick review. And so I like to also kind of think of these as defining, do we have body feathers molted and how many flight feathers do we have molted? So in absent, as the name implies, we have no body feathers molted and no flight feathers molted. So next we have our limited molt. So we have some body feathers molted, but not all. And then we have no flight feathers molted. So our partial molt, we have almost all or all of the body feathers are molted, but we have still no flight feathers molted. So again, that would include primary coverts being retained, primaries and secondaries being retained, and retrices being retained, but all other body feathers being replaced. Next, we have our incomplete molt, and so that's we're going to see almost all or all of the body feathers replaced, and again, and now we're actually going to see some, but not all of the flight feathers being replaced. Oh no, well, they jumped out of order. My apologies. And then what we see is our complete molt, where we see all the body feathers replaced and all the flight feathers replaced in a sequential order. And that is something we're also going to go over in just a little bit. And so, unfortunately, this kind of jumped out of order, but typically you can also remember our molt extents by the acronym ALPIC. So absent, limited, partial, incomplete, complete. So again, when we're talking about a partial molt, can think about most of the body feathers being replaced, no flight feathers. When we say incomplete molt, you can think, oh, we are going to see some flight feathers be replaced and all body feathers. When we say complete, that's going to be a complete replacement of everything. So again, it's just specific definitions, and these definitions are used in the pile guide. So when you're reading about molt, hopefully after this presentation, then now you can actually kind of have a definition of what each of these terms mean. And so, again, this kind of jumped out of order, unfortunately. So this should say the limited, partial, and incomplete molts is where we see molt limits, because these molts are not complete, because they're only a partial, limited, or incomplete replacement of feathers. What we actually see is we see two generations of feathers present. Feathers from the old generation that were not replaced and feathers from the new generation that were replaced, and that's what we define as a molt limit. So the molt limit is really the border between these retained and replaced feathers that result from limited, partial, and incomplete molts. And so we can, we see them in different plumages with different generations of feathers. So for instance, here, the blue line is showing replaced formative feathers. You can also see above those, the lesser and median coverts in this Hispaniola and Spendalis were also replaced. And then you can see actually the carpal covert was replaced as well. And then you can kind of see here where the white line is, these are the retained greater coverts. You can see all the primary coverts are retained, all the primaries and secondaries are retained, though it looks like in this case, at least two of the tertials were replaced. And so this again would be a really great example of a partial molt, again, because we don't typically lump in, though the tertials are technically flight feathers, we lump them in with body feathers when we're talking about molt. So you can see the bird didn't replace any of its primaries or secondaries, but it did replace some wing coverts, in this case, the greater coverts, median coverts, and lesser coverts. And then we can see it retained two coverts and retained the rest of its flight feathers. So this was the result of a partial preformative molt. So these newer feathers being the formative feathers, they're looking higher quality, nicer coloration, and the older feathers being juvenile feathers. So yeah, and then we'll get into how we would age this bird later. Don't worry, you'll see this photo again. And so let's just review real quickly some of our molt extents. So our absent molt, why do we need to have an absent molt, right? And so that one might just not make quite sense because it's a bird that's not molting. But what we actually see is within a species, some individuals might do a molt and some might not. Usually we see this in an alternate molt. And if you read pile in the case of, I think, like a northern water thrush or even ovenbird, it might say absent to limited for alternate molt. So it's saying some individuals are going to do a little bit of an alternate molt, and other individuals aren't going to do it at all. So absent is just, again, to kind of differentiate between, it could be populations or individuals within a species that might, again, because molt is somewhat plastic, so we can see variation, that some of them will do the molt and some of them will not do the molt. When we go to our limited molt, what we usually see is some of the body feathers replaced and none of the body feathers replaced. So what we see here is a molt limit within the body feathers, within the lesser or median coverts. And so you can kind of see within this hummingbird, you can see some of the kind of more golden feathers being the older feathers and the greener feathers being the newer feathers. within this northern parula, you can see these pin feathers coming in around the head, being part of an alternate molt. Often in the pile guide for a lot of our migratory birds, it'll say what the alternate molt includes. So for instance, in a Kentucky warbler or a common yellowthroat, it might say that you see might see some feathers replaced in the head to make those kind of really nice, distinct head feathers brighter, maybe like make the mask a little nicer. And so those would be considered, if you can see the difference between the older and newer feathers, those would be considered molt limits. And that helps us, yeah, define kind of, so that's a limited molt. Often we see that as part of an alternate molt where the birds want to replace some feathers, but they don't want to replace everything. So we have a partial molt. And so here I'll give you guys a minute with these photos and see if you can see molt limits here. While I take a small water break. So what we see in a partial molt, right, is the majority of the body feathers are replaced and we still don't see any flight feathers replaced. So the result is usually molt limits that we see in the greater, median, and lesser coverts. Sometimes we see molt limits between the greater coverts and the primary coverts, something we usually refer to as a versus limit. But here you can see in the lesser Antillean bullfinch, we see these inner greater coverts replaced and the rest of the feathers retained. You can see how these are a little bit longer and they're like a little bit darker as well. So that's a nice, what we call a nice molt limit, right? And then within this banana quit from the Lesser Antilles, we can see, so this one's a banana quits, I will say, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we start talking more about Caribbean birds. Banana quits can be tricky because we just see so much variation depending on the island. But what we see, even though these feathers have these little tips, these are replaced feathers, and we actually see the bird replace all of its greater coverts except the last one. So everything else is retained juvenile feathers. So these are two examples of molt limits we would see in first cycle birds as a result of a partial preformative molt. So that's, yeah. And I believe both of these birds are from Antigua. And so again, just so you can see there's where our molt limits are. And so why do we see these kind of partial and limited molts? So oftentimes when we think about which feathers are going to be replaced, you can think about which are the feathers that are getting worn down the most. And so when we think about a folded wing, our tertials are really taking the heat of the wear. They are protecting the rest of the secondaries, they're protecting the rest of the primaries, and even in some birds like wagtails especially, you can see this in, they'll have really long, and shorebirds as well actually, they'll have really long tertials that really help protect the rest of the flight feathers. So often that's why we see the tertials get replaced in these partial preformative molts. They get replaced with the body feathers because they're just subject to so much wear. As well, we often see the greater coverts get replaced and not the primary coverts because the greater coverts are, again, what's taking that heat of the wear. So that's really what's wearing down from the sun, from maybe branches. But so we really see oftentimes molt limits in the tertials and greater coverts in these preformative molts because those are the feathers getting the most wear. As well, you can see in our tail, you can see that the central rectrices are the ones that are kind of covering and protecting the rest of the rectrices. So we might see these central rectrices also get replaced during a preformative molt, just again, because they are the most likely to get worn down the quickest. So again, when we're kind of thinking about why are birds replacing these certain feathers as part of these partial molts, it's the feathers that are getting worn down the quickest. And because, as I mentioned, our juvenile feathers are lower quality, they're going to wear down a lot quicker. So feathers in these positions are really going to wear down quickly, so the birds are going to want to replace them. It's also why we typically see, when we see the greater coverts get replaced, the interior ones get replaced instead of more of the exterior ones, are the ones closest to the primary coverts. And that's again because these are the ones that are subject to the most wear. So in an incomplete molt, we see most of the body feathers get replaced, and then most to all of the body feathers get replaced, and then we see some of the flight feathers get replaced. So this is a result with molt limits within the primaries, secondaries, and or sometimes rectrices as well. Though the rectrices we have to be careful because we can see a lot of accidental molts there too. So usually again, if we see molt limits within the primaries or the rectrices or the secondaries, we usually want to check to see if that's symmetric just to make sure it was a planned molt. Because if it was a planned molt, the bird is going to replace the feathers evenly to kind of balance itself out. If we see it just on one side, it's most likely the result of an accidental molt. So hopefully I gave you guys a few minutes to kind of see if you could find the molt limits within this indigo bunting that was caught in Puerto Rico. And what we see, so first we can see all the primary coverts are retained, and we can see all the greater coverts have been replaced. So that's a really nice molt limit there. However, that would be from a partial molt. And when we look at, actually, we do see this bird in an incomplete molt. We can see the outer 5 primaries were replaced, and as well as the inner 2 secondaries and the tertials. So we can see these outer primaries have a lot more blue edging versus the inner ones that are much browner. So this would be a molt limit resulting from an incomplete molt, and this is often what we call the eccentric pattern. So what I'm going to review in just a moment is we're going to review the sequence of molt. So when a bird does a complete molt, what's the order that it replaces its feathers? And usually what it does is it starts in the middle of the primaries and it molts its way out, and it starts in the middle of the secondaries and molts its way in. And so because of that, we typically number our primaries from the inside going out, and we number our secondaries from the outside going in, or from the center part going towards the body for the secondaries, from the center going out for our primaries. That's because that's the order that they molt. So in our eccentric molt, it's called the eccentric molt because it's outside of the normal pattern. So what we see is it actually starts in this case at I believe at P5. So we started our 5th primary. Yeah, this being primary 1, 2, 3, 4. So it skipped these 4 and just started at the 5th primary and then molted its way out from P6, P7, P8, P9, which it stopped because buntings only have 9 visible primaries, as we say. So what we see is this is the eccentric pattern where the outer primaries are replaced, the inner secondaries can be replaced. And again, these often get replaced because they are the feathers that would be getting the most wear. So if a bird has the option to replace some of its flight feathers but can't quite afford to replace all of them, it is going to start usually replacing the outer feathers. So next, of course, we have is our complete molt. So here what we see is all of our body feathers and all of our flight feathers are replaced, and we usually see them replaced in this sequential order that I'm going to review in just a minute. And so the result of this is going to be just a plumage with 1 generation of feathers, right? So the bird is replacing all of its feathers, so we only see 1 generation of feathers from a complete molt. And as you can see, this common ground dove that I believe was caught also in Antigua, this bird is in the process of finishing a complete molt, so we can see it still has a couple retained. So while the bird is in the process of the molt, we might be able to age it by comparing the old and new feathers. But once the bird has finished the molt, it will most likely be in an adult type plumage, and after that we are usually not able to exactly age the bird, again depending on what we know molt strategies of these birds, and that's again something I'll get into in a little bit. So if we look at our molt extents and we compare them with alpic, absent, limited, partial, and complete, complete, and we compare our plumages, what we see, right, our basic molts are often, we always consider them complete. With the parentheses, that's our exceptions of some raptors and seabirds, but because this, again, we're focusing on passerines, we're usually not going to catch seabirds in our mist nets. We're not going to worry about that, or large raptors in our mist nets either. We're not going to worry about them. So we can consider our basic molt to be complete. And then our formative molt can anywhere be, oftentimes we see it limited, partial, and incomplete, though there are examples of birds that do a complete preformative molt, but most times our preformative molt is where we're seeing those molt limits, and we see it, often we see it partial to incomplete is the most common. Our alternate molt can be absent, limited, partial. I believe it's only incomplete in some Empidonax flycatchers and maybe some other flycatchers. And this is my cool molt fact for the talk. There are, I believe, 3 birds that have a complete pre-alternate molt, and that is the bobolink, the Franklin's gull, and the willow warbler, though some of the other Eurasian warblers might also do complete molts. But that means that the bird would replace all of its juvenile and formative feathers, and we'd only be left with an alternate molt. But again, because if you can imagine a bird doing 2 complete molts a year, 2 complete feather replacements a year, that's a ton of energy. So the majority of birds are not going to do that. So now what we're going to do is we are going to review our molt sequence. So when we see this kind of order of molt, that's usually going to tell us um, that that's usually going to tell us the bird is doing a complete molt. Um, sorry, 1 second. Okay, cool. So when we have complete molts, there's kind of two options, right? So can have our simultaneous molt. So that's what we see in a pre-juvenile molt. So as you can see when we look, and often when we're assessing if the bird has flight feather molt, we're looking underneath the wing. So if we look underneath the wing and we see all of the feathers simultaneously growing, this is going to be a bird in a pre-juvenile molt. So anytime we want to call a bird in a pre-juvenile molt, we need to see all of these flight feathers molting together. Again, that's a characteristic for passerines that we only see in juvenile feathers. This is the only time in their life that they're going to grow all of their feathers at once. Otherwise, they're going to do a sequential molt, which is what we're going to review in a minute. So there are, though, some birds that can also do a simultaneous or molt, or as it's called in waterfowl, a catastrophic molt, because they're replacing all their flight feathers at once. And that's often in English, we have this phrase that if somebody is in a exposed or vulnerable position, they're a sitting duck. And that's actually where this phrase comes from, because there's a period of maybe 2 weeks for a lot of ducks and geese and other waterfowl where they do replace all of their flight feathers. And so they cannot fly because they're growing all their flight feathers at once. And so because these birds have the adaptation to swim and they can still forage and escape predators, for them, having a 2-week flightless period isn't really that bad because they can still survive. Versus if you were to think about a passerine, or a raptor, a bird that relies on flight, if you can imagine a passerine hopping around on the ground for 2 weeks, it would just be like a little chicken nugget and it would easily get eaten. So instead for them, they do a sequential molt where they're still able to retain that ability to fly while replacing all their feathers. And that's what we see in a sequential molt. And often, again, like I mentioned, we have our primaries numbered from the interior going outward. So this is our first primary. This is where the complete molt is going to start. And then our secondaries start right next to it, secondary 1, and then we number them going towards the interior of the wing. And again, just to review really quickly, we can see our primaries, secondaries, tertials. We have our greater or secondary coverts, this little light blue guy being the carpal covert. We have our primary coverts, and we have our lula, and of course we have our lesser and median coverts. And so again, we're going to review this actually in a cool little graphic, but you can just kind of see this as an overall graphic of what it looks like when a bird's wing is molting. We usually see symmetric molt in both wings, again, because this bird wants to maintain the ability to fly. So what it needs to do on one side, it needs to do on the other. So it kind of has a sense of balance. It might not be exactly symmetrical, but most times it is. But we usually see it more or less symmetrical. And so if we review, and again, this is just a nice review of all the terminology again, and you can see the bird has replaced these primaries, and you can see these kind of outer primaries that haven't been replaced look quite a bit worn versus the new ones coming in. All right, so here's our wing. I won't quiz you guys on the parts, but I'm guessing you're all quizzing yourselves right now, so good job. But now what we're going to do is we're going to review how the bird is going to molt. And so this isn't exact in a complete molt. Again, there can be some variation, but this is kind of the pattern we typically see. So often we see the molt start in the lesser coverts, and usually they'll molt a nice chunk of them, and they might keep a little patch. And then the bird will move on to the median coverts. And then usually the tertials will be replaced again because those are feathers that get worn down really quickly. They are one of the first to be replaced, though they can also be replaced with the greater coverts. Again, this isn't an exact order, but it is kind of a general order. But the important thing is really when we're seeing a pre-basic molt start, we're kind of seeing these things simultaneously. We're seeing the lesser and median coverts molting. We might see the tertials get replaced, but what we're seeing is the first primary is molting with its corresponding primary covert. And so from here, this is when the pre-basic molt has initiated. And so we're going to see the bird start replacing its feathers going outwards. And usually during this point is when it's also replacing the greater coverts. And often what we see is it kind of replaces all the greater coverts at once. It replaces most of the median and lesser coverts at once. So these feathers are growing in what we call, again, tracks. They're growing together. So, but the bird is replacing the primary with its corresponding primary covert. and the next primary with corresponding primary covert. And usually once we get to about primary 4, that's when the bird is going to start on the secondaries. So now the bird is going to start on the secondaries going in, and it's going to continue working the primaries going out. And usually around this period is when the alulas get replaced. And so our very last feathers to be molted in a complete molt are the 10th or 9th, the outermost primary, and the innermost secondary, which is secondary 6. So often secondary 6 is considered the very last feather to molt, though sometimes we see secondary 6 and primary 10 growing at around the same time. And usually, once we see these feathers growing, we no longer have any of the old feathers to replace it with. So that's when the bird is finishing a pre-basic molt, and usually they're molting a lot of body feathers around the same time. So that is our sequential molt. Another thing to just note real quick. So as you can see, the birds start at the first primary going out and don't start on the secondaries usually until P4, primary 4 has been molted. So because of this, when a bird does a complete molt, we often see contrast, a slight amount of contrast between the first secondary and the first primary. And that's because the first primary was grown before the first secondary. So it's maybe had not a ton of time, but maybe 3 to 5, 3 to 7 more days of wear. And so we often can see the first primary contrast a little bit with the first secondary, again, just because the first secondary wasn't grown until the fourth primary was molted. So that is what we call a moltcline when we see this subtle difference between the wear of the feathers based on how they were molted. Again, because the bird isn't molting all the feathers at once like a duck or a goose, because they are molting them sequentially, feather by feather. This gives them the ability to fly, but it means that some of the feathers they grow first will wear a little bit more than the feathers that are grown more recently. And so that's what we consider a moltcline. Hopefully that's not too confusing to people. But again, we go secondaries going in, primaries going out, and then that's the bird has completely replaced all of its feathers. So of course we can have some unusual molt patterns. I'm not going to touch on this too much again because we don't see this too much in passerines. And I know already molt is a confusing topic, so I don't want to overwhelm people with too much more molt. But we can see the Staffelmauser molt that we see in raptors and some parrots. And so what we see is the birds kind of, so you can see it starts at P1, P4, and I think like P7, for instance. And then it might just replace these 3 feathers, and then the next year it'll replace the ones next to it. And again, that's for birds that spend, like raptors spend a lot of time in the air. They're really not able to do like that full sequential replacement like a passerine. So they're just going to replace chunks of their feathers every year in kind of a different order. And so that's something we can see in raptors and parrots. But again, I'm not going to cover that too much. Typically with our tail, what we see is it molts from the inside going out, and that's called centrifugal. So that's our most typical tail pattern where we see the central retrices grown first, but we can have centripetal, which we see in some tropical birds where it grows from the outside going in, though we don't see that as often. Okay, so hopefully hopefully everyone's on the same page. I guess this would be a great little pausing break. We're about halfway through. How are people feeling? Are there any questions you want covered? From here on out, we're going to use all of this molt theory we just covered, and we're going to go into the WRP system for aging birds. So this is where a lot of these age codes you might be seeing come from. We're going to kind of dive into that, how to use that for especially our Caribbean birds, and go through a lot of examples. But I guess, yeah, this is a good pausing moment. Are there any questions? Here, I'm not sure if I can see. We'll just stop sharing real quick. So yeah, do we see any questions? Okay.
Yes, and just a reminder that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or at this point, you can unmute yourself and ask questions in English or Spanish, whichever you feel most comfortable in.
Okay. Cool. All right, so if there's no questions, then I think we will
It's time
Keep
for a
going.
quiz, Holly, I think. Everybody,
Yeah,
no questions.
no questions. It sounds like you guys want a quiz. Yeah. Molt quiz it is. Um, all right. But I just wanted to pause because it is a good, yeah, we're gonna keep going. All right. On to the next. Oh wait, here we'll go here. Okay. So now we are going to jump into the WRP system for aging birds. And so a lot of times too, just to touch really quickly, the reason this is created is that it works a lot better for birds, especially in the tropics. In the Caribbean, we do tend to see a lot of birds follow kind of a similar breeding pattern, especially when you go higher into the mountains. You do see birds follow a similar breeding pattern to the global north, where you see kind of like a summer breeding season, though you do have a lot of birds in the Caribbean that can breed year round, and you see a lot of birds in the neotropics breed year round. So the traditional system of aging was based on our calendar year, where we would age birds according to how many of our calendar years they'd existed in. So we had our hatching year birds that were born like this summer. We had second year birds that were born last summer, so they had existed in 2024 and 2025. Then we had our after second year birds that were born before last summer, so in 2023 or before. We had our after hatching year birds that were born in 2024 or before. So again, that was based on our calendar year. And then we could say that because in North America, the majority of birds are born between May and July. So we know when they're all born. However, in the tropics, we see birds can be born in December. They can be, I think I caught baby banana quits in March. I've caught baby banana quits in December. They can be born all the time. And so the calendar year doesn't quite make sense. And it kind of uses our own sense of time. And so instead, it makes more sense to put this in perspective of the bird. So this is a plumage-based aging system, going over a lot of those plumages we talked about. So let's dive into it. Let me see, actually. Maybe it doesn't want me to dive into it. Okay. There we go. So with our WRP, so WRP stands for the three people who created it, which is Jared Wolf, Brant Ryder, and Peter Pyle. So that's where the WRP name comes from. But the WRP is an aging system that uses three-letter code. So in our first position, so in this case, I did keep these in English because the letters right now are based in English, and so we see them used in English. But I do have a full translation of the WRP coming up in the next table, just as wanted to kind of clarify why. So first, what we have, it's based on one, the molt cycle. So which molt cycle are we in? Again, that based on how many complete pre-basic molts has this bird done. So are we in our first cycle where the bird has only done that pre-juvenile, that complete pre-juvenile to the juvenile plumage? Has only done that as its first molt? Are we in a second pre-basic molt? Are we in our third cycle? Or once again, once we can't really tell, then we use definitive to say adult. So once that bird has finished that second pre-basic molt, lost the last of its juvenile plumage, we can just say it is definitive because it will continue like this definitively. So that's our first letter. So our second letter is, does this bird have active molt or not? And so here we're going to use C for, this one's a little bit confusing, but we're going to use C for cycle. So that means the bird does not have active molt. It is in that cycle. We use pre for active molt. So the bird is molting into its plumage. So it is not in its plumage yet. So it's pre. So that's why I use pre in front of molt. So pre-basic molt, pre-formative molt, pre-alternate molt. And again, with this P or C, we really want to consider, is this bird actively changing into a new plumage, or did it accidentally replace feathers and it has to replace them by default? So we only want to use the P when we know that bird is changing into a new plumage. And so that's why books like Pyle and some of the stuff we're doing in the Caribbean to help define molt for Caribbean birds a bit better is we can actually start to say, okay, when are these birds molting? How many feathers do we see them molting during a preformative or pre-alternate molt? So that can help us determining whether or not to use that P by knowing the molt extent for that bird. And so our third letter is our plumage. And so our options for plumage, we have that juvenile plumage, we have formative plumage. I believe we don't, sorry, I should have updated this this slide specifically, but I believe instead of supplemental, we now use auxiliary, though that's still kind of a debated plumage. So don't worry about that one. The ones you want to worry about are juvenile, formative, basic, and alternate. So we're going to use J, F, B, and A are the ones we're going to use. So that's our three. So it's pretty easy, actually. So those are the three letters we're going to use and what they mean. So if we look at this cool table, we can see, and this is where I did include Spanish translations for everything. But again, the letter that is used is based on the English word. So again, in our first position, we can have unknown. So it's also okay to say we're unsure. So we can have unknown, we can have first cycle, we can have second cycle, we can have definitive cycle. That's usually all we're going to use for passerines. And some birds like raptors or woodpeckers, we might use third cycle. But then once we kind of jump up, to a fourth cycle, fifth cycle bird, maybe in examples like seabirds or again raptors, then we're actually going to switch over to a number and we're going to use the number 4 for anything 4 and up. In our second position, again, we can also say unknown. So if we're not sure if the active molt that a bird has is actually molting into a plumage or if it is accidental, we can always say unknown. Again, we're going to use cycle if the bird does not have active molt, and we're going to use P for pre if the bird does have active molt. And then again, just to kind of review the plumages, if we're unsure of the plumage the bird is in, we can always say unknown. We have our juvenile plumage, we have our formative plumage, we have our basic plumage, our alternate plumage, that being the reproductive plumage, and again, our auxiliary plumage, which is a plumage we see in some buntings and grosbeaks. Don't worry about that. I left that one at the end because it's not one you should worry about, unless you're catching a ton of buntings and grosbeaks, then speak to me afterwards, I guess. But these are the ones you really want to worry about. And so, not to hopefully confuse anybody further, but, oh, and then real quick too, to just kind of review, we can kind of also now start applying these different WRP codes to the birds in that molt cycle, right? So if we look at a bird in a complex basic strategy, that when it is in the nest, molting all its feathers, it's in its first pre-juvenile or FPJ. When it leaves the nest, it's in its first cycle juvenile. So then, because again, those feathers are low quality and the bird cannot live an entire year in those juvenile feathers, if it's a passerine, it's going to do the first pre-formative molt or FPF, and it's going to molt into its first cycle formative plumage. And it's going to spend a year like this because it is molted into higher quality feathers. And then after it tries its first breeding attempt, it is going to do the second pre-basic molt or SPB, molting into a definitive cycle basic plumage, where again, we cannot distinguish a DCB bird that has done a second pre-basic molt from one that has done a 10th pre-basic molt. They're all going to look the same. We can only use our hopefully recapturing that bird and then using its band number to age it. But then after that, every year we'll do a definitive pre-basic molt or DPB and molt again into a fresh DCB plumage, and it will continue like this definitively. So now again, not to confuse anybody, but there was recently some additional codes added, which pretty cool. And these are just, I find them, they're really nice as clarifiers, right? So I find these as like a clarifying prefix is what I call them. And so the one that you're going to see most often is M, which is minimum. And oftentimes we use that when we have doubt. So one thing I'm going to go over later in this presentation is how we age birds and some of the ways that we age birds and some of the age codes we use. And I would say even the best banders in the world can't age every single bird. And there's always going to be some intermediate birds where you just aren't sure if it's an older or younger bird. And so the best thing to do is to use this minimum. And often what we can do is we can say, well, what's the minimum plumage we know this bird did? Or what's the minimum molt we know this bird did? And oftentimes for many birds when we're unsure, because the formative plumage can look very similar to it, can look almost identical to the basic plumage depending on the extent of molt, we'll usually use minimum first cycle formative as a way to convey doubt between an older or younger bird. And again, it's a nice way to say, well, we know at minimum the bird did a formative molt because it's in a mostly adult plumage, or it's in as far as we can see an adult plumage, but we're not sure if it is that first cycle bird or it is definitive cycle, so we're going to say minimum first cycle formative. So there's a few other ones. I'm just going to touch on them briefly because I don't want to confuse anybody too much. But we have A for after hatching year and H for hatching year. So you might be thinking, I thought we got rid of this whole calendar year thing. What's up with these codes? But The reason is these are used to distinguish between what I would call a first year bird that is actively breeding and a first year bird that has recently left the nest. So, for instance, there might be some birds, let's say, for example, here, especially, I think you see it a lot more in the global north, but you might see it also where you're going to have overlap, right? So you're going to have birds that are going to do their very first breeding attempt. And then when those babies of that bird, so that's going to be a bird that's a first cycle formative. So let's think about maybe a red-legged thrush that has a nice molt limit. So a bird with a nice molt limit that's a first cycle bird doing its first breeding attempt. When those babies leave the nest, they are going to do a preformative molt, and you're going to have two birds that exist as a first cycle formative. One that was born very recently and one that is almost 2 years old. And so in order to distinguish that, we can use the A and the H. So we can use the A really if the bird has breeding characteristics. And that's again something I'm going to cover a little later. So that's when we see like the brood patch, we might see a cloacal protuberance, we might see something that indicates the bird is actively breeding. We can say, okay, this is an older FCF bird, an older first cycle formative bird that probably is at least 6 to 8 months old, versus seeing a bird that still has a very open skull, still has a gape. Again, things I'm going to talk about a little later in this presentation. We can call that a hatching year bird, so a bird that recently left the nest. So it's a way of distinguishing between first cycle birds that are breeding and that recently left the nest. The other code I recently learned is we also have suspended. And so we can have some birds that start a molt and then for whatever reason they stop it. And so what we see in that we call a suspended molt. And so in a suspended molt, what we assume is when we see the molt has stopped, we assume that the bird is going to pick that molt up later. So usually I've seen this a lot in the tropics with birds that, let's say, maybe there's a prolonged rainy season, or maybe there's an abundant amount of resources, or maybe it's an El Nino year. And so what we see is the birds might do another breeding attempt. And because we can see molt breeding overlap in tropical birds, but because that those are two very energetically expensive things, like we kind of talked about in the beginning, because of that, what we see is we often see the bird will suspend or stop the molt so that it can breed. And once it finishes breeding, it'll resume the molt. So if we see a bird that it looks like it started kind of at that first, it was started a complete molt. Often we see it when it starts a complete molt and stops it. So usually we'll see it started that complete molt. It replaced maybe its first 5 primaries, as well as those first 5 primary coverts, and then it stopped the molt. Then that's what we would call a suspended pre-basic molt. So just another code. Again, these 3 codes, we don't use that often. The minimum is really the one that you're going to find most useful. And then just a quick review again, just to look what all these age codes kind of are and the order of them. We have, right, our first pre-juvenile, first cycle juvenile. We can have auxiliary in some rare cases, but again, I wouldn't worry about those. Into our first pre-formative, first cycle formative, first pre-alternate, first cycle alternate. And we are going to actually review these codes with our molt strategies that we saw earlier. So don't worry about this too much, but these are just some of the WRP codes, and then the designated, what they mean. It's helpful sometimes to have a list like this printed out at your banding station with the codes that you use most often. Most likely, unless you're doing raptors or seabirds, you're probably not getting into 4PB, 5PB, 6PB, but the ones that are most useful are the ones that are all bolded, which are the ones you're most likely to see at your average passerine or near passerine banding station. Okay, so if we review our basic strategy now, what we now have is the bird is going to start in the nest doing its first pre-juvenile or FPJ, molting into this juvenile plumage or first cycle juvenile. So, right, there's a bird that has all juvenile feathers. And then this bird is going to spend an entire year in this juvenile plumage, and then it is going to do its second pre-basic molt into its definitive basic plumage, right? So in this schematic, we can see it's the second basic because we were following this bird, for instance. But when we catch this bird in the wild at a banding station, we can't distinguish it from any other basic bird, so it's just going to be a DCB. And then the next year, it's going to do its definitive pre-basic into, again, a definitive cycle basic. And we're going to see this DPB to DCB occur annually. So next, if we go into our complex basic strategy. So first, right, we have our first pre-juvenile. And right, again, we're thinking complex basic. So we have an inserted molt in the first year of the bird's life. So we go first pre-juvenile into first cycle juvenile. But again, this is probably a passerine. Maybe it's a red-legged thrush, or maybe it's a black-crowned palm tanager, or a lesser Antillean bullfinch, a bird that has a fairly low-quality juvenile plumage. So it's going to do a first preformative molt, molting into its first cycle formative plumage, and then it's going to spend a year in that plumage. It's going to attempt to breed, and then it's going to do a second pre-basic molt, molting into its definitive cycle plumage. And then after every year after that, it's only going to do one molt, that is the definitive pre-basic, into the definitive cycle basic. So we're going to see it alternate between DPB and DCB once a year for the rest of its life. Next, we have our simple alternate strategy. And so here what we see is we have our, okay, here we go. So we have our FPJ in the nest. The bird is growing all its feathers. Then it is going to molt into a first cycle juvenile. And then we have our first pre-alternate, where it's going to molt into a first cycle alternate, or FCA plumage. From here, it's going to probably attempt to breed, or maybe it just wants to hang out in the half-breeding plumage. And then we are going to do our second pre-basic molt, but once the bird has lost its very last juvenile feather, it is going to be a definitive pre-basic, or DCB. And so then every year after that, the bird is going to go from a definitive cycle basic, a DCB plumage, to going to molt into a DPA, definitive pre-alternate, into a definitive cycle alternate, which will then rotate back into the DPB, and then it'll rotate forever between DCB and DCA, doing 2 molts a year, doing that pre-basic molt, which is that complete replacement, and the pre-alternate molt, which is probably a partial to limited to partial molt. So next, we have our most complicated one, but don't worry, it's not too scary. We have our FPJ, right? So our complex alternate strategy. So where we're going to see the most plumages, especially in the first year of these birds' life. We are going to start in the nest with an FPJ, molting into an FCJ, that first cycle juvenile. From there, that bird, again, it's probably a migratory passerine, like a chestnut-sided warbler or a black-throated blue warbler. Actually, no, black-throated blue warblers don't do alternates. So maybe a chestnut-sided warbler, or a prairie warbler, or a Cape May warbler, to think of some nice Caribbean examples. So we're going to have our first cycle juvenile. It's going to do the first preformative molt into the FCF, first cycle formative. And so then, right, if we think about this as a migratory passerine, as a bird like a prairie warbler, this bird is going to migrate to the Caribbean in its FCF plumage. It is then going to hang out in the Caribbean over the winter, maybe in Puerto Rico, and then it is going to do its first pre-alternate, probably sometime between January and March, and is going to molt into its first cycle alternate plumage. It is then going to migrate in this plumage and is going to arrive ready to start breeding in North America in this first cycle alternate plumage, which again is not well illustrated here, but we're actually going to see 3 generations of feathers. We're going to see juvenile, formative, and alternate feathers. After the bird tries to breed, it's going to do its second pre-basic, or SPB, and molt into a definitive cycle basic. And again, if we think about the life of this bird, it is going to migrate to the Caribbean in its DCB plumage, where it is then going to do a DPA, a definitive pre-alternate molt into an alternate plumage, usually around February, March, and then it is going to migrate back in its definitive cycle alternate, or DCA plumage, try to breed, and then after breeding, it is going to do its DCB, and it will continue doing that for the rest of its life. It'll alternate between a DCB plumage, which is what we will see in the fall, and it'll be in a DCA plumage in the spring when it attempts to breed. So again, thinking about like a migratory passerine, I feel like that's kind of helpful to think of the difference between the FCA and FCF and the DCB and DCA. So if we look back now at our example that we saw earlier, that we saw this really nice molt limit in, now we can actually say, okay, how can we age this bird? And so when we were looking at this bird before, if you remember, we saw that it had retained these outer 2 greater coverts. It had replaced the rest of its greater coverts, had replaced the rest of its median and lesser coverts, had replaced its carpal covert, and then it had retained all of its primaries and secondaries and retained all of its primary coverts. So we see 2 generations of feathers here, right? These replaced feathers are formative feathers, and these retained feathers are juvenile feathers. So We go to our WRP code. The first one that's usually the easiest letter to answer is this bird actively molting? So in this photo, you can't tell, but I'm going to tell you, since I abandoned this bird was not actively molting. So we know that first letter is C. Okay, so we know it's C, we know it's not molting. So now we can think about, okay, which plumage are we in? So what we see, right, we see two generations of feathers. We see juvenile and we see formative. So we always want to use the plumage that was most recently molted. So in this case, we've reviewed the molt strategies a few times. We know the formative plumage comes after the juvenile plumage. So we know this bird is in its formative plumage. And so we know we only see the formative plumage in the first cycle of the bird's life. So we can get to FCF, first cycle formative. Hopefully that makes sense. And there we go. That's how we get to that age code. So let's try another one. So this is a photo from Daniela from Cuba of a red-legged thrush. And so in this case, we can see, right? I'll give you guys a minute to look at it a little bit closer up. We can see that this bird is actively molting. And we do see, and I'm going to tell you again because we can't open up the wing and check, but anytime we see this active molt, we do want to check to see if it's symmetric. And in this case, it is. And so we can say, okay, we have active symmetric molt. So now we can say, okay, we know, oh no, my circle's moved around. Okay, well, this is supposed to be around the letter P. So imagine this around the letter P. So we do have active molt. So this is a P. And now we say, okay, so if we see this bird doing a complete replacement of its feathers, this also takes a little bit of puzzle work, a little bit of thinking. So in the case of red-legged thrushes, and in the cases of thrushes, we know that they usually do a partial to incomplete preformative molt. So we're not going to see this symmetric flight feather molt when they're doing the preformative molt. We're usually only going to see replacements in the greater coverts. And then I think in the case of these red-legged thrushes, we do see them replace their tails. But in this case, right, when we see this complete flight feather replacement and we know that isn't part of the preformative molt, we can kind of already jump and go, okay, we know this is a pre-basic molt because this bird is doing a complete replacement of feathers. We don't see all the feathers growing at once, so we know it can't be a pre-juvenile molt. Also, we do see quite a bit of wear. So again, sorry, these circles kind of jumped around on me. But we're going to imagine this is actually around the B. So we have determined this is a bird doing a pre-basic molt. So now we need to determine which pre-basic molt is it doing. So again, we have eliminated the first pre-basic molt because if it was a first pre-basic molt, we would see all those flight feathers growing together. And we don't see that. We see them growing in that sequential order that we reviewed. So we know it's not the first pre-basic or the first pre-juvenile molt. So our next options are second pre-basic and definitive pre-basic. And so in this case, this is when I always caution people that you really only want to use second pre-basic if you have kind of like a 95% certainty, because you're always, especially in a lot of birds that are in the Caribbean has some pretty strong sunlight, you're always going to see contrast between old feathers and new feathers, right? These old feathers have been wearing down for a year, and these new feathers are recently replaced. So we're always going to see that contrast between the new and old feathers. So what we now want to determine is, do we see enough contrast to determine that these are actually juvenile feathers and these are basic feathers, or are these actually old basic feathers and these are new basic feathers? And so in this case, again, it might not be as easy to see in this presentation, but when we can kind of zoom in, and if we were, as I always say, optimizers on, which is what we use for bird banding to kind of take a closer magnified look at the feathers, we can actually see that the primary coverts really don't have much edging. We can really see how brown the feathers are. We can see they're really worn. They're even kind of a little bit more of a pointed shape compared to these kind of nice and rounded new primaries. So in this case, I think we can say that these are juvenile feathers being replaced with adult basic feathers. And so the only time we see that is in the second pre-basic. So again, my circles got a little messed up, but we're going to imagine this around the S, and this is a bird we're going to call a second pre-basic, or an SPB. So once this bird has replaced the very last of its primaries, we don't know if it's done the second pre-basic or the definitive pre-basic. So often you can there's kind of a little bit of, there's molt debate in this subject. You could call it still a definitive pre-basic because every pre-basic is molting into a definitive cycle basic, or DCB. Or if you want to convey some of your doubt that you don't know it was a second pre-basic or definitive pre-basic, you can call it a minimum second pre-basic, again, to kind of convey that doubt when you don't have any more feathers to compare to. So that is a cool example of an SPB. Um, And so again, the WRP, my apologies, I did translate this, but I guess it didn't stick. But the result is a collection of standardized age code that can be used for any species in the world. Again, because we're aging these birds based on their plumages, and because we know all birds fall into one of four molt strategies, and we know they're all going to do these plumages. So it's a really cool way of kind of universally aging birds. Again, so it works in North America, it works in the Caribbean. That's kind of the cool thing about it. It works everywhere. And so what we also see then is when we apply the WRP, the preformative molt is partial. So that allows us to distinguish these FCF birds from the FCJ and the DCB. This being an example, I did my best to put in as many Caribbean examples as I could. This is an example from Ecuador, though, where we do see a nice molt limit right here versus we see the adult basic feathers all looking nice and uniform. So that those partial preformative molts allow us to age a bird through that first year of its life because we do see the formative feathers and the contrasting juvenile feathers versus once the bird is in that definitive basic plumage, we just can only say, well, we know it's an adult. We can't say exactly how old it is. So again, that's why these partial preformative molts are really helpful for helping us age birds. And so here's a cool example from the Caribbean, just again to kind of practice these WRP codes, right? So our first bird, here's our first bird, and we can see it has uniformly, and we're just gonna say that this bird is not actively molting for the sake of practicing these codes. So what we see is this bird has these tiny little buffy tips all throughout all of its coverts. We can see it has a gape. We can see the red around the eye doesn't look as strong. So this is going to be a bird that's an FCJ. And you can also see it just has those buffy tips all over. So that's a really great example of a bird in a distinct juvenile plumage. Now this bird is going to do its first preformative molt or FPF. And then afterwards, it's going to be in a first cycle formative. So again, there is a slight difference. This is from Daniela from Cuba, and these are two birds from Dominican Republic. So they are slightly different subspecies, right? So we might see a little bit of differences, but overall the concept is the same. And so what we see, right, is we can see that the bird replaced these greater coverts. We can actually see these outer greater coverts still have a little bit of that kind of buffy tip to them. And we can see overall there's much less edging on the primary coverts. The primaries and secondaries overall look pretty worn. We can see this bird replace two of its tertials. So this is going to be a bird in a first cycle formative, right? A bird that is not actively molting, where we see two generations of feathers. We see these nice, more adult-like formative feathers, and the rest are retained juvenile feathers. So then 1 year later, this bird is going to do a complete molt into that pre-basic molt, and then we're going to see this bird as a DCB. And this is a cool comparison, right? Because we can see these three plumages. We can see how the juvenile feathers really wear down a lot more versus when we compare them to a definitive cycle basic bird, a DCB, we can see the primary coverts are much nicer, much darker. They retain a lot more of their edging. Again, because this bird spent the time to grow its feathers kind of one by one, so they're much higher quality feathers. And you can just see overall, we see one generation of higher quality feathers versus in our first cycle juvenile, we see one generation of lower quality feathers. This bird does look fresh, right? Because it probably just left the nest. However, these feathers are going to wear out over time, which is why we have the first cycle formative to get into a majority adult plumage, though the bird did not have enough energy, right, to replace all its feathers. So a cool example. So now let's look at another example from the Dominican Republic. So what we see here, this is the black-crowned palm tanager. I will, as note, this bird, a little bit of red is not part of the plumage. I think this bird got a slight amount of net abrasion in the net, but it is a good example of a juvenile bird. And the bird did, I can tell you, it flew away fine and it was okay. That is why I use this as an example. But what we can see again is our first bird is a nice FCJ. You can actually see kind of all these feathers have this almost like little buffy tip on them too. You can see overall the feathers. It looks pretty nice overall, right? Because this bird like just recently left the nest. But once we compare it to our FCF, we can actually see a nice molt limit right here. This one again starts to get into territory. I will say molt limits can be very subtle. It takes a lot of training to see these differences in plumages. So things that I say might be more obvious molt limits still are fairly subtle plumage differences. But what we see here, right, is we can see that these Inner greater coverts are a brighter green. We can see all these lesser and median coverts are even a brighter green versus a more olivey green here. And we can even kind of see the primary coverts have this looser quality when you compare them to the DCB bird, which now these look a lot nicer. What's cool is what I've noticed, at least in the black crown palm tanager and the green-tailed warbler, which are both in the same endemic family, Phaenicophylidae, I believe. They actually do have a fairly distinct formative plumage, which is why I have these head shots. So you can see in the juvenile feathers or the juvenile head, you can see that the eye spot is still pretty olive, even like still pretty, it's not very bright white in the juvenile feathers, and the head still is fairly gray. And that actually is kept through the formative plumage. So you still see that maybe it molted a little bit of this, but overall we still see pretty gray infused in the head. We can see that that front spot is a lot more greenish compared to the back one. And this is why actually this bird is called the cuatro ojos, or four eyes, because it has these one, two, and on the other side, three, four eye spots. But then when we get into our definitive cycle basic, we can see that it has molted, it has a completely black crown, and that these two eye spots are now very bright white. So kind of just a cool example of looking again between the plumages of different age classes. And so just thinking again about some species in the Caribbean that have this partial preformative molt, we have toadies, this little guy, they do a partial preformative molt. A lot of the Turdidae does, again, with some exceptions of the Cuban, which I'll actually go over that in a minute. We have a lot of vireos, a lot of warblers, Parulidae, Chlorophonius species, which is our endemic Caribbean euphonias. The Spindalis do partial preformative molt, the Phaenicophylidae, the black crowned, and I would assume gray crowned palm tanager, though I've never banded one, so I can't say. And then both the white-winged warbler and green-tailed warbler, they both do partial preformative molts. Some bananaquits do partial preformative molts. Bananaquits, again, are one that are just tricky because you see them do different molt strategies on different islands, which I think is it's really cool to see, actually. And so then actually getting into bananaquit, let's look at an example of a bird with an incomplete preformative molt. So again, I put this as complex basic parentheses alternate because I think some of these birds can have an alternate molt and some of them might not. But we can see overall, so our first one is an FCJ, right? So a first cycle juvenile, we see all of the feathers look completely juvenile. They kind of have these nice buffy edges to them. And you can even see that the chin is yellowish. You can see it has a yellow eye stripe and it has a yellow gape. Then when we get into our first cycle formative bird, we can actually see this bird replaced the outer primaries, or hopefully you can see. Again, this might not be coming across super clear because you can't zoom in too much on the photos, but you can see hopefully that it replaced these outer primaries, retained the inner primaries, retained the inner secondaries, and then replace these inner primaries. And then you can see it retained all of its primary coverts. They look very worn, but you can see overall, if you were to just look at this bird, it looks overall like an adult. It has the gray chin, the white stripe on the head. Sometimes I have noticed that there are some in, I believe, Antigua, we were noticing that they retain a little bit of yellow in the forecrown, or the forecrown stripe, that can also be indicative of a formative bird. But then looking again at this bananaquit from Puerto Rico, when it does its complete pre-basic molt, we see everything really nice and even. And then we can even see the white stripe look really nice and white, nice gray chin. And so overall, very adult looking bird. And you can see, I believe this might have to do more with sex, but you can see some variation in the amount of white in the primaries, right? So these being the replaced primaries having more white than these juvenile primaries here. So measuring this white patch is likely thought to help us with aging and sexing these birds, but the famous last words, more study needed, is something we will continue working on in the Caribbean. And so thinking about some Caribbean species with incomplete preformative molts, we have some Contopus, some of the endemic pewees most likely do these. I think, again, more study is needed. We have the kingbirds, gray kingbird, loggerhead kingbird. Myarchus can do anywhere from a partial to an incomplete preformative. We have mockingbirds, Mimidae, Icteridae, some of the endemic Caribbean orioles. Again, some of the bananaquits can do an incomplete preformative molt. The red-legged thrush in Cuba does an incomplete preformative molt because, as Danielle has noticed, we do see them molt all of their rectrices. We have our grass quits, yellow-faced and black-faced. I've seen both seem to do consistent incomplete preformative molts. And then, of course, woodpeckers, which I'm going to touch on in just a minute. So again, and this is not an extensive list by any means. This is just what I could think of that is currently known for the Caribbean. I'm going to take a quick while. But so in a lot of species, right? And I am going to talk about other ways of aging birds, but again, this is a molt fit focused talk, so of course we're going to talk about molt. But so for a lot of species, we have this partial or incomplete preformative molt, so that allows us to distinguish an FCF bird from an FCJ and a DCB, like I kind of mentioned earlier. But what do we do in cases where the preformative molt might be complete? And so the best option is honestly to look at the skull, right? So in the case when a bird does a complete preformative molt, that means after it left the nest, instead of retaining some juvenile feathers, it replaced everything. And so we cannot distinguish an FCF bird from a DCB bird because both are in an identical plumage. And so what we can do is we can look at the skull a lot of times, and this is where this kind of skull ossification, and again, this is something I'm going to touch on a little bit later about what exactly this means. But oftentimes with birds, they have two layers of skull. It's kind of similar to how people have these soft spots in their head. And so when we can actually see this process develop because birds have this fairly transparent skin. And so we can see where there's two layers of skull and where there's one layer of skull. And as long as we know the bird does fully ossify its skull, we can use this to age the birds after they've finished a complete preformative molt. So if we see the skull is still open, so we see this contrast between this pink where there's one layer and this white where there's two layer, we know the bird is a first cycle bird. However, if we see the skull kind of almost full or completely full, we see this a lot in wood creepers, which seem to do a very quick preformative. So I think this more for my friends in Trinidad and Tobago. But we see a very quick, complete preformative and a very quick skull ossification. So oftentimes, if we already have a complete skull, because the skull, I would say, takes anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months, depending on the bird, to completely ossify. So it's one of those things. If you see an open skull, you know it's a younger bird. But if you see a complete skull, you don't know that it's not a younger bird that already completed its skull. A fun use of double negatives there. So what we essentially don't know is if it's a younger bird that completed its skull or an older bird. They're going to look essentially the same. So we use that prefix now comes into handy. So we call the bird a minimum FCF. And in some places you'll notice I have FAJ in parentheses. So formerly we used FAJ as the code, which was first after juvenile. But as you can tell, that sounds pretty confusing. So we changed that, or the authors, WRP, Wolf, Ryder, and Pyle, changed that to minimum FCF to make that just a little clearer. So we're saying the minimum that this bird is, though we are conveying some doubt as we are not sure. So again, if the bird does a complete preformative, we can use the skull. We might be able to use the eye color, as is the case in some wood creepers. But again, most of those characteristics are only going to be useful for the first month or two of the bird's life. And then afterwards, kind of, yeah, from 3 months onwards or from 2 months onwards, a young bird, a first cycle bird will look identical to a DCB bird. So to kind of practice that, I chose a species that is the ruddy quail dove that is found on a lot of islands in the Caribbean. And so what we see here is the ruddy quail doves often do what we can say, a lot of doves do an incomplete to complete preformative molt. And so we have our first bird, right, is an FCJ. So we see all of these nice little buffy tips. They kind of have similar buffy tips to thrushes that we see, kind of those nice little triangles. And you can even see overall the bird looks really buffy, kind of overall really dull plumage. And then as this bird, you can see it actually, so it's replaced these primaries. It's in the process of starting to replace its secondaries, and it's now replacing, I believe it's starting on its 5th primary. So while we still have, and you can actually see if you zoom in, you can see that these primary coverts still have those retained buffy tips. We can still see some retained buffy tips in the tertials and secondaries. So we know that this bird is actively doing its first preformative molt. The ruddy quail dove also has a really cool eye color change too. So catching this bird with symmetric molts and this really dull eye color, you can see it's kind of gotten into a mostly adult plumage. This is an example of a female. But we can still see some remnants of juvenile plumage with active molt. So we know this bird is undergoing its first preformative molt. But now, right, when we get to this nice adult bird, so in this case, right, our plumages kind of jump because this is an example of a male and these birds are sexually dimorphic. I could not find an example of an adult female in this case. And this bird also had a small bill deformity, but it was actually fine. It was a healthy bird. But what we see is we do see this really nice even plumage. But in this case, right, we knew or we know that the bird can do a complete preformative. So we can't rule out the case that this is a first cycle bird that already replaced its feathers, that already changed its eye, which again, that's going to occur within the first, I would say, 1 to 3 months. So our first cycle formative is equal to our DCB. Our FCF is equal to our DCB. So this is when we would actually use that minimum FCF. As we are not sure, we know this bird at least did that complete preformative molt, so we can say it's a minimum FCF, and hopefully if we band and recapture this bird, it'll give us better aging data, but this is all we can say with the data we have. However, in birds like this, when we actually catch them doing their next complete molt, so in this case, right, we can see contrasting worn feathers with new feathers coming in. We can see that the bird's eye color has already changed. We can see it is symmetrically molting. Well, I guess it's not as clear from this photo, but I can tell you this bird was symmetrically molting. Now what we can actually say is we know that this bird is not doing the first preformative molt, so we can call it now minimum second pre-basic because we know it's at least doing another complete replacement of its feathers. So we pass the preformative and we can kind of jump to the next replacement since we have two contrasting generations of feathers. But since we don't have any of those being juvenile, we know that it already replaced all its juvenile feathers. So the next minimum molt we know it's doing is the second pre-basic. Hopefully that is not too confusing. And if it is, just drop me a question at the end of the webinar and I would be happy to explain. So some species with complete preformative molts. Again, this is more for Trinidad and Tobago. We have Furnariidae, Dendrocolaptinidae. Those are our wood creepers. We have some of the Thamnophilidae, mostly Pithes and Hemnopithes but other Thamnophilidae will do partial or incomplete preformative. And then we have some doves, cuckoos, so oddies a lot of times can do complete preformatives. We have some hummingbirds, some swallows, and some tanagers or some birds in the Thropidae family. This is when we can see those complete preformative molts. And again, I do imagine there could be variation on an island to island basis. This is just kind of, again, what I know and what I've seen, but hopefully, again, more study is needed and we are working to understand our Caribbean bird molt even better. So now applying WRP, this is our next level WRP. In some species, right, we do see our pre-basic molts can be regularly incomplete. And oftentimes we're going to see this in woodpeckers, we're going to see this in raptors, like I mentioned, and in seabirds. And other birds, too, have a delayed plumage maturation. We often see that in manakins, in male manakins. So we do need to use these additional codes. And this is when we might see a second cycle basic, a third cycle basic, a fourth cycle basic. Fourth cycle basic would be we see juvenile feathers, we see older second basic feathers, we see slightly newer third basic feathers, and then we even see very fresh and new fourth basic feathers. So again, we can age these birds going back to as many generations of feathers as we can find. Those being the juvenile feathers kind of let us start. And if we can't find any juvenile feathers, but we see 3 cycles of feathers, we can say, well, minimum this bird has done 3 feather replacements and call it a minimum third cycle basic. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's review a couple examples of those. So this is actually example. This was one I couldn't find from the Caribbean, but it's a cool example from Costa Rica. And I do believe in Trinidad, you do, and maybe Tobago, you get the gold, well, in Trinidad, I think you get the golden-headed manakin that has delayed plumage maturation. And in Tobago, I believe you get the long-tailed manakin that does delayed plumage maturation up to 4 cycles. And in golden-headed, they won't get into the like gold head, black plumage until 3 cycles. But this is kind of an example of what we might see. So this is the white ruffed manakin of Costa Rica. And so I skipped the first cycle juvenile, but we're going to start with first cycle formative instead. And so what we see is we see a nice, or again, nice being relative, but we do see a molt limit here where these inner greater coverts are a bit longer, a bit brighter green, and then we see the rest looking a bit duller. The males and females in this case are going to be identical, so we cannot sex this bird. We can just say this is a first cycle formative bird. So then, quick water break. What's pretty cool then is this bird will do a complete pre-basic molt. So its second pre-basic molt will be complete. If it's a female, it will stay in a similar plumage to this. However, it's a male, it will actually molt into an intermediate plumage. And so that's what's really interesting, right? This is actually a plumage acquired from a complete pre-basic molt. However, we just see that it's an intermediate plumage. So this is a bird we can actually call an SCB based on that full plumage. And we can see even that the feathers look a bit nicer. You can even see that there's more edging on the primary coverts. So this bird did do a complete replacement, and then it just started to get some male plumage in, but it's not quite fully sexually mature yet until it does its third cycle basic, which is when we will actually see it molt into these really nice, in the case of a male, really nice kind of black, blue, iridescent feathers, and then it'll get its definitive white ruff, kind of nice beard. And so this is the bird, so we can call this bird a DCB, right? Because if you catch this bird, it will continue to molt into this plumage every year. But what's actually kind of cool is if we want to be more exact, we know this bird has done at least 3 pre-basic molts to get into this plumage. So to be a bit more precise in our aging, we can actually call it an MTCB, which is kind of cool. And so now to take an example of a woodpecker. So I know people get very intimidated by woodpeckers, and this is actually, these are pulled from a paper that Josh Lopergola and I wrote describing the molt of the Hispaniolan woodpecker. And so it's actually cool as you can see these patterns emerge in woodpeckers as well. So woodpeckers do an incomplete second pre-basic molt. So that means they're going to hold on to juvenile feathers for an extra year, which is pretty wild. But their juvenile feathers, apparently they don't feel the need to molt them all in the second pre-basic, so they hold on to them. So what we see here, and this is again just another, I threw this photo in as a little bit clearer example, is we see an FCF bird. So we see that this bird has replaced, you can see it here too, this bird has replaced its inner greater coverts. And then a lot of times with birds that do incomplete second pre-basic molt, so we see this in puff birds, we can see this in kingfishers. Oftentimes where we see retained feathers are in the primary coverts or in the secondaries. In this case with woodpeckers, I find the primary coverts to be very helpful. So if we zoom into the primary coverts, we can see that they are all uniformly juvenile, and we can see a very long 10th primary in this case. So we see a nice molt limit in the greater coverts. This one's a bit more subtle, but we can see it's replaced these inner ones, and then the outer ones are retained as well as all of the primary coverts. So now when we jump to our next year, we see that this bird has replaced some of the primary coverts. So it's replaced the outer 2 primary coverts and the inner first and the inner primary covert, but it has retained all the rest. So you can really see these contrasting juvenile feathers with nice replaced feathers. And this is where you can even start to look, you can kind of see the juvenile feathers look a little bit looser. They look really worn. And then you can see the replaced second basic feathers look really nice. So now that you have a really nice example of a bird that we know is a second cycle basic because we know it's replaced. Now we see all the greater coverts looking nice and even. We can even see kind of some of the secondaries and primaries looking a bit nicer. So we actually can say, okay, this is a bird that retained these juvenile feathers for 1 extra year. So we know it's in its second cycle. And then kind of similar to the last example, we can call these adult birds, so birds that have all even plumage, we can call it a DCB, or we can call it a minimum third pre-basic. And in the case of woodpecker, or minimum third cycle basics, minimum TCB. And in the case of woodpeckers, what they'll sometimes do is they'll kind of retain these random primary coverts. So they'll still do incomplete molts every year, but they will get rid of all of the juvenile feathers and just kind of retain older basic feathers. And what's cool actually is if you compare, you can see this primary covert I'm highlighting is retained. And if you compare that to the juvenile primary coverts, you can see that this one, yes, it's browner, it's more worn, but it looks similar in quality to the rest of the primary coverts versus you can see these juvenile feathers look kind of noticeably looser, they look noticeably worse. So a retained, this is kind of the difference between a retained basic feather and a retained juvenile feather. And so in the case of this, right, we know that the bird did at least 2 pre-basic molts in order to, we have 2 generations of basic feathers. So we can call it, well, we know if it did at least 2 pre-basic molts, that's going to be the second pre-basic and third pre-basic. And so we're going to call it a minimum TCB. Hopefully that makes some sense. And hopefully now woodpeckers don't seem as scary. And so now to just kind of wrap up, how can we use all of this information and some other criteria to determine the age of a bird? And so some of the things we see in young birds, and I didn't have a good Caribbean example, but I wanted to use a neotropical example. So I used the orange-billed sparrow here. So oftentimes, right, we can see the presence of juvenile plumage. I was recently banding in Costa Rica, and one of the banders there really described it well. The juvenile plumage has this really loose quality and actually kind of looks like a palm leaf almost, like it's very loose and kind of spread out. So often you can even see in this juvenile orange-billed sparrow. It looks a lot fluffier, it looks looser. You can even see it kind of has more olivey tones to the plumage versus in the adult, it has a really strong black bib, really nice gray feathers. And so you can really see that's some of the things you can see with this juvenile plumage and passerines. It really is a lower quality plumage. It looks a lot looser. In some cases, I usually find too the best place to look at juvenile plumage is the undertail coverts. That's where you can really see them look very loose and fluffy. But in the case, right, where you might have a bird where the juvenile plumage and adult plumage look pretty similar, you can look at bill color for some birds. You're going to have some bill color changes. You can look at eye color. You can look at skull ossification, which again is something I'll touch on in a little bit. And so again, you can see this juvenile plumage came from a complete molt and is a poorer quality than this adult plumage that also came from a subsequent complete molt. So during the pre-juvenile molt, right, we see all the feathers grow simultaneously. And so because of that, right, because their feathers are growing all at once, and because they want to get out of the nest and grow these feathers as quick as possible, these are some of those differences we see between juvenile and adult feathers. So I guess also to clarify here, adult feathers, so formative feathers, even though they are subadults, kind of that subadult intermediate plumage, we do still consider those adult quality feathers because the bird is taking more time to molt them, so they're molted and they're molted nicer and they're molted in a higher quality. So, and if I were to hold here a formative and a basic feather, you would not be able to tell the difference because they're the same quality. But because of that, when we have these preformative molts, the adult quality feathers contrast with the juvenile feathers. So here are some of the differences we see. So in juvenile feathers, we often see them shorter. We usually see them have a pointier shape. Usually they are less dense. So again, that's going back to that barb density. So there's not as many barbs on the rachis, so they tend to have a looser appearance. The rachis might be thinner. It tends to discolor quicker as well. So it might kind of be more of a duller or milk chocolate brown. And we tend to see juvenile feathers wear down a lot quicker, again, because they're poor quality. Versus in an adult bird, we can see the adult feathers be longer. So we can actually see what we call these step molt limits where adult feathers are a little bit longer and the juvenile feathers are a bit shorter, which I think is what we saw in that mannequin example. We see the shape be more truncate, so more rounded out or more squared off. We tend to see the barbs, they look denser. So we see more barbs on the rachis, making a denser appearance, making the feather look tighter. The rachis can be a bit thicker. And usually we see the colors are a bit brighter. We see more edging. The edging hasn't worn off yet. So again, because it's higher quality feathers, they wear a bit slower. So even the coloration and the edging of the feathers also going to wear slower. So it's going to overall appear nicer for longer. It's just an example here. So you can see here on the left, the shape of the feather is very pointed, and versus here in the adult feather, you can see it's much more squared off. You can actually even see the juvenile feather, just overall, the feathers look more transparent. They look lower quality versus the adult feathers do not look as transparent. They look a bit nicer. And again, kind of getting into that barb density. So I like to think of this is if I kind of took a pen and I drew the barbs of each feather, and if I drew the barbs of an adult feather and then drew the barbs of the juvenile feather, I would just find less barbs on the juvenile feather and more barbs that are tightly packed together on the adult feather. So this is kind of when we talk about feather quality, a lot of times this is what we refer to. We refer to adult feathers having a higher barb density, so looking overall tighter, looking nicer, and then juvenile feathers having lower barb density, so they overall have a looser appearance. That's kind of what we're talking about there. Again, just because these feathers are grown quicker, they don't have as many of those barbs. And then it's similar, we see this in wear. So this kind of more pertains to migratory birds, right? But in If we compare a juvenile feather in the fall, it is naturally going to look fresher because it recently molted, but you're going to see by the spring it's going to be really worn down, versus an adult feather will also look fresh in the fall, recently molted, but is not going to wear down as fast as a juvenile feather will. We also we can have growth bars. So growth bars occur when birds are metabolizing during the day and during the night. They have different metabolisms, so you get kind of like these nice natural bars that occur due to differences in metabolism for when they're growing feathers in the night and the day. And then what we see in some birds like wrens, they can actually melanize. I think during the day they'll melanize the growth, and so then that's actually how you get that barring. But what we can see, so this is a great example. You can see that there's this nice growth bar. So this is probably due to some sort of lack of nutrition, which is making this kind of even more clear. But you can see all of the feathers have this growth bar. It's completely aligned. So it grew all of these feathers together at once. And again, that's something we're only going to see as a younger bird. We often see it in the tail that when a bird grows it's all of its tail feathers at once, which usually is an indication of a juvenile bird. We can see all the growth bars being aligned. This one is one I would use with caution. So if you see it in the wing, it's pretty reliable that this is a younger bird. But if you see it in the tail, you can still have, again, you can have birds lose their entire tail and grow it at once. And if they had some sort of lack of nutrition or something happened while they were growing their tail and that growth bar comes across clear, then it might not be an indication of a juvenile bird. It is really just an indication the bird grew its entire tail together. But most times we see that in juvenile birds. And then we also have fault bars, which are these here. So again, that's kind of something that happened to the bird. Maybe the mom didn't bring as much food, or it had some sort of malnutrition, or something happened. It couldn't eat that much while it was growing the feathers. So then you can have these, what they're called fault bars. Is a damage to the feather occurred while the feather was growing. And again, just to kind of compare, often in juvenile birds, we can see growth and fault bars all completely aligned, versus in adult birds, because the birds are growing those feathers one by one, especially in the tail and the flight feathers. Maybe something happened, but when it happened, it's going to have occurred at different stages of the growth of the feather, so you won't see those be aligned. So then again, when we're looking for molt limits, we want to have some idea of what the preformative molt is in these birds. And so again, for some of our Caribbean species, what's really cool is we're still describing this, but we usually want to look for molt limits that occur from limited, partial, or incomplete preformative molts, and we're usually going to see those contrasts. So that's when, even if we don't fully know that molt strategy, we can look for some of those characteristics that, just to back up, that I talked about here. So we can look for some of these characteristics of comparing juvenile versus adult feathers. Even for birds we might not know the molt strategy, we can still get a good sense of juvenile versus adult feathers. And so we can, again, compare juvenile feathers with replaced formative feathers. And the more birds that we see, especially of more individuals we see of a species, then we actually start to solidify the patterns we're seeing. That, okay, we're seeing that the red-legged thrushes are replacing the greater coverts, or sometimes they're replacing all of them, sometimes they're replacing some of them. We can just start to get a sense of these patterns. So here's just another nice example of checking for molt limits. So here this bird does have several molt limits. And if we zoom in, optimizers on, as I like to say, you can see a nice contrast between the primary coverts and the greater coverts. So these being juvenile, these being formative. We can actually even see here in the primaries, there's a molt limit too. So we see that primary, the rachis is a lot darker here. And actually, again, this is kind of a nice example of those differences in barb density. So if I take a pen and draw out each barb on the feather, there's going to be less of them on the juvenile feather compared to the formative feather. So we see this nice formative and juvenile. So again, just some good examples of what we're looking for when we look for molt limits. And also we can have additional differences. We can have some more distinct juvenile plumages. In some birds, it's an ocellated ampered. We can see differences where the skin coloration can change. We can see eye color differences. We can see that a lot in wrens. I see that in the Phaedocophilidae and Hispaniola, the palm tanagers and the green-tailed warblers, I like to call them, so not real warblers. Often we could use the lining of the mouth. That one's really useful in catbirds. That one can be useful in vireos as well. And so you can kind of use all these different characteristics to help us age the bird. Though again, the plumage is going to be the one that lasts, that formative plumage is going to last for an entire year. So if we have molt limits between juvenile formative plumage, that's going to tell us the age the longest. And so we can also, though, one of the most useful things you can do is look at skull pneumatization or ossification. You can use either word. And so again, what's really cool is young birds hatch with a single layer of skull, and then throughout the next several months of their life, they'll develop a second layer of skull. And because birds' bones are hollow, they'll kind of develop these little bone columns between the two layers to support them. But overall, again, you can see it's very hollow, but you get these nice two layers of skull that can help protect the bird's head. And then what we can see though is when we can actually look on the skin, we can see the two layers of skull. So we can actually see if there's one layer of skull or two layers of skull. So we often see contrast between a more pinkish color, that tends to be only one layer, versus a whitish color with these little dots that are these bone columns, that would be two layers of skull. And so you can kind of see, here's a nice example. So here are these kind of pink unossified skull windows versus you can see all of this. Those are all ossified skull. And again, if I go back to kind of look at it again, you can really see this, the difference between this kind of pinkish part versus this whitish part. So this pinkish part being only one layer, the whitish part being two layer, and you can actually kind of even see these little white dots, and those are the bone columns connecting the two layers. So this would tell us this is most likely a younger bird. And then this is kind of that process of ossification. We do see, and again, I think this is more applicable for Trinidad and Tobago. We do have some birds that aren't going to fully ossify their skulls. That I have seen in some manakins, some euphonias, Mionectes flycatchers, which is a small tropical flycatcher. They almost never ossify their skull. They kind of stay at a 3. And what's cool, right, is I've actually recaptured those birds from 5 years ago that still have a skull of 3. So when I recapture older birds that still have these open skulls, that's a good indication that these birds don't ossify their skulls. So we can see some of these tropical birds break these patterns. But overall, I would say, especially in the Caribbean, most times if we see an open skull, we know it's a younger bird. And if we see a full skull, it doesn't necessarily tell us it's an older bird, right? Because it could just be a bird that's 6 months old that already ossified its skull. But it can be a sign of a bird that's at least a little bit older. Maybe not like beyond first cycle, but again, just a semi-helpful characteristic. In the pile guide, what you'll see is there are skull dates, which are pretty helpful for our migratory birds. And what those skull dates mean is oftentimes we have, it'll say, for instance, October 1st, and that is when pile noticed the hatching year birds starting to ossify their skulls and look like adult birds. So in the fall, that's really useful for our migratory birds. And then the spring, by that time, most of the migratory birds have already ossified their skulls, so it's not as useful, though some younger birds can retain what we call windows, or still a little bit of contrast between the 1 layer and the 2 layer. So again, this is kind of the process, these being kind of birds that recently left the nest, these being birds that are probably doing a preformative molt, and then we can see them retain these windows for up to 6 months. But then sometimes otherwise we do see them completely ossify their skull, probably by 6 months old. Though this can be sooner, and birds like wood creepers ossify their skull, I would say, within the first month after leaving the nest. And then also just to look, not all birds are going to follow this pattern, so we can actually see quite a bit of variation in the pattern of ossification and that pattern of kind of like how the skull develops. So this is just a cool example of these different patterns of the ossification. And you could see, I actually put this sideways so again, you could see this is kind of when it starts out, and this is as it gets older. So you can see some birds will just still retain these small windows, that even older birds of 2, 5 years old by recapture might still keep these. And so then I think too, just something that's good to consider and I promise I am almost done. I know it's been a 2-hour webinar, so thanks everyone for sticking with me. But we can have reliable versus useful aging characteristics. So our reliable aging characteristics are things we can use almost just that characteristic to age the bird. And this could be if we have an open skull that's really reliable of a younger bird. We can have those molt limits if we're really confident that's what we're seeing. So those are reliable characteristics versus useful characteristics. You really don't want to use just that characteristic to age the bird. You want to use it in addition to other aging criteria. So that would be the growth bars in the tail, maybe the tail shape, right? Especially for older birds, anytime a bird accidentally replaces feathers, they're going to grow in like an adult bird or in that adult shape. So seeing an adult tail might not necessarily indicate an adult bird. We really want to use those kind of things with additional criteria. So we want to use an adult tail with seeing no molt limits and a completely uniform adult plumage. So again, we just want to use different aging criteria in order to determine the age. So one of my friends and a good bander in Belize, Abita, she has a really great analogy that's like, we want to be bird lawyers, right? So we want to create a case in order to age the bird. Really, we don't want to use just one characteristic. Even if we're really confident we see a molt limit, we still want to look overall on about what that bird is doing. And just, a quick example, here we have this common yellowthroat. You can see some of the tail feathers look really worn, but we can see it maybe accidentally replaced a few of them. And then when we look at the wing, though, we can actually see maybe we have a nice Alula molt limit. Maybe the greater coverts have been replaced, but then we can see overall that the bird looks pretty nice, has a nice mask. So this is most likely a younger male that has replaced some feathers in its mask as part of an alternate plumage. So again, we want to just look at the complete picture of the bird. What are we seeing? What do we know about this bird? Even if sometimes, and I know we're still working to understand our Caribbean birds a bit better, but even if that bird in specific isn't in the pile guide, we can still look and see, well, maybe Hispaniola and Peewee isn't in the pile guide, but what other Contopus species are in the pile guide? So what is known about at least this genus of birds? Where can I start? So even just things like that can really help us when we're aging our Caribbean birds. So again, the other thing too is there will always be intermediate birds. You can't age every bird as an FCF or a DCB, so it's always okay, even with birds that we know they do a partial or incomplete preformative, it is okay to use MFCF in intermediate birds where we're just not sure. And in hummingbirds, often hummingbirds can have a complete preformative molt, so we can use these little bill striations. I think these bill striations are most likely used to support the bill as it's keratinizing, but we see these bill striations go along 100% of the bill in younger hummingbirds, and then in older or hummingbirds that are at least past, I would say, 2 to 6 months old. Similar to that skull ossification, we can really only use this when the hummingbirds are very young. We do see completely smooth bill. So, and usually they lose the striations from the tip going inwards. And then just real quick, how do we sex a bird? So a lot of times with males, we have the cloaca will swell up, and this is this external sperm storage for birds. So this is a pretty good indication of a breeding male. We also can have birds that develop brood patches. I find a lot of birds, especially in the tropics, males and females can have brood patches. So that's going to be kind of more family dependent and what's known about the life history of the bird. If it's known like a bird, like a manakin, for instance, where males are lekking and females are the only ones that take care of the nest, when we see a brood patch, we can say pretty confidently it's a female. But in other birds, we can have males and females that both develop these brood patches. So I find this is just a better indication of a bird with an active nest. But in some cases, we might be able to sex the bird. And then, of course, we do have by plumage as well. So my rule with this is you always want to age the bird before sexing the bird. So these are two Spindalis. The one here on the right is actually a younger male, and the one over here on the left is an older female. So you can see the younger male still is a little bit brighter than the older female, but you just can start to get these overlap in plumages where older females will start to have male characteristics. And so you just want to be careful, and you always want to determine the age of the bird, look at those molt limits, look and see how what the overall plumage looks like before sexing the bird. And I actually always encourage people who bird to really look at this because people are really quick to assume these kind of birds are just automatically younger males, but they might actually be older females. So it's always just good to age the bird before you sex them. And then just again, these are some additional references and resources for anyone that is interested. I have a whole folder that we share with our workshop participants that have all sorts of manuscripts in them. We will be making this presentation available as well as a recording, but just some cool, if you're keen to read more about molt, Stephen Howell has a fantastic book. There's always the pile guide. The first 40 pages are very useful, and I include that in my molt folder. The molt and neotropical birds, I would say this is the most helpful if you are working in the Amazonian Brazil. There are a few birds that you might be able to use this for Trinidad and Tobago, or I would use this more for family accounts, but it really is the most helpful for South America and Brazil. But it is still a cool book if you're interested in reading it. This is also a very nice book, Biology of Molt. And then now I am happy to take any questions. So feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand. I know that was a lot of molt material, 2 hours of molt material to be exact. So yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in and happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Wow, no questions. I guess we do need to do a molt quiz on the next one.
Hi, Holly.
Yeah, hello.
Hi. Can we apply this to the hens and the roosters? Because I've seen a rooster with all its no feathers at all. What is that about?
So can we apply this to chickens and like domestic birds? Is that the question?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think in some cases you can. I think they will go through the basic things. However, what I have noticed with domestic birds, and you see this with parrots, with any sort of birds that are kept domestically, is they have kind of nonstop access to resources. So they can just start to do weirder molts, like they can molt at any time. They can just replace their feathers throughout the year. What you might be seeing in a rooster that's lacking a lot of feathers, that could be a rooster that's getting ready to breed and just decided to drop all its feathers. It could be a bird that got into a fight and lost a lot of feathers, especially with roosters. I know that they can really get really hormonal and they can fight. So that could be what you're seeing. There is also a variety of rooster and chicken maybe I've seen in the Caribbean that just are I don't almost said headless, but they're featherless on their heads. And there could just be some variation too, which is these birds just never grew feathers on their heads, and that could just be a genetic variation. So I think there could be a combination of things. With domestic birds, you just do seem because most of the times with our wild birds, a lot of the molt is resource dependent. So you even see in North America, some birds do molt migrations. And so they'll actually, we see it a lot in the Western US, is these birds will breed and actually, right about now, we start to get monsoon season in the Southwest. So a lot of these birds will finish breeding. They'll migrate to the southwestern US, so like Arizona, Mexico, and then they will actually do their pre-formative and pre-basic molts there, where there is this abundance of resources from the monsoons, and then they'll continue on with their migration afterwards. So we really see molt timed with a lot of resources, with a lot of phenology. And so because domestic birds are birds kept in captivity just can't have this access to resources, we just can kind of see some weird things. So, ooh, um, let's see what else. Oh, cool. Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you for tuning in. Always a pleasure to have you. Um, okay, and Daimi asks if we can share experience with Caribbean grackles. So my experience with Caribbean grackles is similar to what I've seen in North American grackles. They can do an incomplete preformative molt where they can actually replace almost all of their feathers. So that's a really extensive incomplete preformative molt. And the best place to look for molt limits is actually in the underwing coverts. And so I think actually Caribbean grackles, and I haven't caught that many. I think I've caught a couple, mostly actually I've caught them in Puerto Rico. But what I have noticed is it does seem that they only retain juvenile feathers in their underwings, underwing coverts. And you have to be careful here. There's some cool, I can share some pictures with you from what I've seen. But what I have seen is that the juvenile feathers again have a bit more of like a loose. You're always going to see kind of two types of underwing coverts, and so you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that's the molt limit because that actually is you just kind of have one tract of underwing coverts, and then that kind of goes like here directly under the primaries and secondaries, and then another tract that goes more down. So these will naturally contrast with each other. But when you see the molt limits, you'll actually see contrast within those feather tracts where you will see these more brown or retained feathers. And that's where I've seen molt limits. However, I would almost say that without those molt limits and without further knowledge of the birds, it might be best to just call them minimum FCF until we actually know more about them. And until we start seeing kind of, okay, we know for sure that's what they're doing. But to my knowledge, I think they can do a very extensive, incomplete preformative molt. So, but hopefully with banding stations like yours, Daimi, in Puerto Rico, we'll start to learn more. Okay, we have a question from Jose. I have seen in the past the blue and gold macaw voluntarily enter into a molt when other birds in the flock were stressing him, and it happens constantly, and they can lose all their feathers at once. Yes, that can happen. And again, with birds in captivity, they are subject to other pressures. They also are given more resources, so these birds can kind of enter into a stress molt. So if they can be kind of pressured into molt, if they are bullied by other birds, they might lose feathers and try to replace those. But sometimes with captive birds, they can only replace these feathers so many times before kind of damaging the follicles, which is then why you also might see birds that when they pluck their feathers or when they get plucked by other birds, they reach a point where they can no longer grow those feathers back, unfortunately. So yeah, it's always really important to just kind of, if you have birds in captivity, be very careful of them, be very careful of their interactions because they can affect each other's feather quality and molt. But it is cool, right? A lot of this stuff that we're talking about can kind of be applied very generally, which is really neat. I think it's really neat. I'm a molt nerd. Cool. Well,
Questions?
thank you everyone for attending. If you have any other questions, feel free to always put your questions in. If you're in our Caribbean bird banding group, always put your questions there. Otherwise, please always feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to answer any and all questions. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone for tuning in to our first of our webinar series. I'm planning out some more exciting webinars, so definitely stay tuned because we have more webinars to come.
Yes, for sure. Yes, please stay tuned. And thank you, Efren. Sorry, as always,
Yes.
to make you translate your own thank you, but
Yeah.
thank you for helping with translation. We really
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you so
it.
much.
All right. And yes, we did record in both English and Spanish. So if anyone wasn't able to make it, we will share the recording with everyone as soon as possible. So take care, everyone.
Well, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Take care. Happy banding. Happy molt.